We're working from Life Sciences Paper 1 of November 2022. Now we move on to question 3.3. The diagram below represents a part of the human ear. We're not going to look at the questions. We are going to first interrogate what it is we're looking at. So when you look at it, you should recognize certain parts belonging to the ear. Here's the pinna. That's the part of the ear that you're familiar with, but inside your head, there's far more than just the little pinna that hangs on the outside of your head. And so you'll just glance at this diagram and say, there's the auditory canal, here's the middle ear with those three bones, here's the membrane called the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. Here we've got our 1, 2, 3 semicircular canals, and that is where balance and position of the head are going to be measured. And here we have the part where hearing takes place, which is the cochlea. So you've used some terminology, you've familiarized yourself with what you're looking at. This diagram is very, very straightforward. It could have come directly out of one of the textbooks or one of the notes that the Department of Education has sent you to help you practice. Sometimes, though, the diagram may look slightly different, and you have to apply what you know to a new situation. But this diagram is very, very straightforward. And if you've learnt the eye and the ear as nervous system receptor organs, then it should be very, very familiar to you. When you learnt about the eye, you had one function, and that was vision. But now, learning about the ear, we know that there are more than one functions. There's the function of hearing, and then there's the function related to balance and the position of our head in 3D space, and things like acceleration, how fast we're suddenly moving in a particular direction. And so you would have said, right, that part of the ear deals with those aspects, and this part of the ear deals with hearing. All right, we've familiarized ourselves with what's going on. Let's start looking at the questions. Identify part C. Go to our diagram. I think I've scribbled enough in blue, so let's look at the parts in green. This part of the diagram, the part that is almost like a little snail shell, that is the place where hearing is going to be dealt with. And this part is called the cochlea. All right, the cochlea, 1 mark. You may have seen this word, cochlear. That is when we use the word as an adjective. So adjectives, remember, describe nouns. This is the noun, the thing, the part is called the cochlea, but we would maybe say the cochlear cells are found in part C, and that's when it gets an R on the end. State one function of part D. Right, we're going back up to part D. Here's part D. We've got to name one function. Now, we've got 2 other similar structures in the ear. They are windows or membranes across an opening. So if we look, we've got a passageway, we've got this, I'm drawing it in kind of 3D, a membrane stretched across an opening, and then the passageway continues. This structure, this membrane, is going to have a different function depending on where it is. So the first of those membranes is the eardrum or tympanic membrane. Up at the top here we've got, and you can see the shape of it, the oval window that has a membrane over it, and here is the round window. Our question was not to name it, but to state its function. Now, we know that sound waves come into the ear via the auditory canal. They vibrate the tympanic membrane, which causes the ossicles or little bones in the ear to knock against each other, which causes the oval window to vibrate, and these vibrations then are transmitted into the inner ear from air-filled chambers into liquid. And so it's in the liquid now that these waves are going to continue. But we're going to have sound waves going into the ear, into the cochlea and coming out. And the round window helps to reabsorb those sound waves so that we don't hear them again. And what it's doing is it's preventing an echo. It would be, if you didn't have your round window working properly, you would hear you say something, life sciences, quieter and quieter, because the sound waves would pass through this window and trigger another round of hearing of the same thing. And that would be extremely confusing. So the round window absorbs those sound waves. So we've got to say that it absorbs the sound waves in order to prevent an echo. And that is the function then of the round window. We now have to state one function of the receptors found in part C. Go back up to our diagram. Part C, we said, was the cochlea. What do we call the actual receptor cells? Remember that we have a structure like the eye with its retina, like the ear with its cochlea, and they're going to be receptor cells that pick up the stimulus and transfer that stimulus via a nerve to the brain for interpretation and processing. What do we call those receptors? Remember, in the eye, they were the photoreceptors of the retina, the rods and the cones. We've now got to identify what are these receptor cells called in the cochlea. Remember that they have a slightly more complex name, organs of Corti. Corti with a capital C because it's actually a person's name. Probably one of the first scientists to either locate those little cells or work out what they did. So our organs of Corti are synonymous with our rods and cones in the eye. They are the receptor cells for hearing in the ear. Explain why a build-up of earwax at part A may result in temporary hearing loss. Notice we're not saying deafness. Deafness kind of implies some permanence, whereas we're told that this is a temporary hearing loss. Let's go and look on our picture for where part A is. All right, so here we go. Here is part A. And if we say that there's going to be a build-up of earwax around here, what is going to be the consequence? Well, we can see that while I'm up here, our tympanic membrane is not going to be able to vibrate like it should. Sound waves coming in are going to meet with this waxy obstruction. And yes, some sound waves may move forward or move through it or around it, but not all of those sound waves. And so the person will not be able to maybe pass the information on as violently or as fully as they would if there wasn't this earwax buildup. So our question again, explain why a buildup of earwax may result in temporary hearing loss. We're looking at the word explain, and it's out of 2 marks, means we need to unpack something. So the buildup of earwax just before our tympanic membrane or our eardrum is going to mean that the tympanic membrane does not vibrate properly. And therefore, those vibrations are not passed on to the ossicles and in turn to the cochlea. And so we're going to see that if we don't have the air being vibrated, the ossicles then passing those vibrations on, we're going to get temporary hearing loss. Of course, it's temporary because if you find that you can't hear out of your one ear and it's sounding or it's feeling like there's something blocked there, it's sounding a little bit like you've got cotton wool in your ears, you can go to a doctor, and the doctor or the clinic will simply syringe your ear by squirting some water into the auditory canal, which dislodges the earwax, and you put your head on one side and the earwax comes out. Grade 12s, you are not to stick anything in your ear. Don't try and push an earbud, for example, into your ear, because that's going to push that earwax even deeper and firmly in against the tympanic membrane. You're certainly not going to stick your fingers, matches, toothpicks, or car keys into your ear. It must be taken out by a clinic sister or a doctor because they know what they're doing. So, as I've told my students, the smallest thing you put in your ear is your elbow. And they all look at them and say, but that could never fit in my ear. That's the point. You don't put other stuff into your ears because let's say you used a toothpick. You could have the toothpick going right through the wax and you could penetrate the tympanic membrane and cause a lot of damage. So guys, let the professionals do it. Okay, moving on. 3.3.4. A grommet is a small device that allows the air to move into and out of the middle ear. This prevents pressure buildup in the middle ear. Explain how the use of grommets in the treatment of middle ear infections prevents hearing loss. And it's an explanation, so we have to earn our 4 marks. Let's go back to the diagram, which is now a big mess. So we're going to take everything there off and we're going to go back, and now we're going to look at what we are talking about in this subsection. In this question, we're talking about a grommet, which is a little hollow structure that's inserted into the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. Have you ever had a throat infection where you had a sore throat and then a few days later you have sore ears? And that's because bacterial infection has spread up your eustachian tube into the middle ear, and it has filled this middle ear that should have air in it. It's filled it with liquid and pus, and now the pressure is starting to expand as the ear that in the middle ear should be air is starting to fill up with liquid. It starts to increase the pressure, and that's what causes the pain. But also, instead of our ossicles vibrating in air, they're trying to move in thick mucus and pus, and that's going to affect your ears. This very often happens in young children and even babies who are very often sleeping a lot on their side, and we'll find that milk can also move up the eustachian tube into their ear, their middle ear. A lot of things involved with infections are going to particularly cause this situation in young children. So, the child has a mild, a very light anesthetic to put them gently to sleep, and the grommet is inserted into the eardrum. And look what it does. It provides a passageway that is not the eustachian tube for liquid and pus to drain out of the middle ear. It's supposed to drain down the eustachian tube, but if the eustachian tube is blocked itself, we need another way, because if the pressure builds up and builds up and builds up, it's going to burst that tympanic membrane. And if that tympanic membrane bursts, it can't pass messages on to the ossicles, so the sound waves are not transmitted to the cochlea, and that means deafness. So to prevent that, we make this little hole in the tympanic membrane. We insert the little grommet, which is hollow, so that the buildup of fluid can drain out of the ear. All right, taking that information back, explain how the use of grommets in the treatment of middle ear infections prevents hearing loss. So we've got to talk about the fact that the hearing loss would come with a burst tympanic membrane, and it's going to burst because of a pressure buildup in the middle ear. Because of increased pressure in the middle ear, that middle ear will expand and burst the tympanic membrane, and that will result in deafness or hearing loss. The grommet, on the other hand, is inserted into the tympanic membrane, and the grommet is like a little hollow tube, and so the liquid inside the middle ear can drain out, and that's going to be effective in preventing the bursting of the tympanic membrane. So that's quite a lot of explanation that you have to give in order to get your 4 marks. 3.3.5. Describe how the receptors in part B, let's go all the way up to our diagram again. Part B, we're looking at the semicircular canals, the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear. Describe how the receptors in the vestibular apparatus or the semicircular canals are involved in maintaining balance when there are changes in the speed and direction of movement of the head. So I want you to imagine yourself walking and you're looking ahead and you're moving in one direction, and suddenly a dog comes from the one angle, and now instead of walking, you're going to turn position and you're going to run. So the direction of the movement of your head and the speed at which your head is now moving have changed. But you keep your balance, right? You don't fall over. So something must be feeding those changes in direction and that acceleration forward. Something must be feeding that information to the brain. And the brain is able to very quickly process that so that it is going to send messages back to your skeletal muscles and the muscles of the core of your body so that you don't fall over. All right, so let's describe how those receptors bring about those checks and balances. And I've put it together here in quite a complicated picture, but let's go through this picture very, very slowly and carefully. Here are our semicircular canals, and they are orientated in 3 dimensions. So we've got a horizontal one, we've got a vertical one, and we've got one that is at an angle. So here's our horizontal one, our posterior one is at right angles, and this anterior one is also at right angles. At the base of these semicircular canals, we have got an extended or swollen part, and that is called the ampulla. Within the ampulla, and we must remember that these semicircular canals, very much like the cochlea, are filled with a liquid. And this liquid or endolymph can move depending on the direction of your head, the position of your head. And at the base of this cup-like structure, this cupula, we have got hair cells. And the hair cells are called crista or cristae inside this cupula, and they are going to bend over depending on the direction or position of your head. And of course, if it's a sudden movement, they'll bend over quickly. If it's not so much of a sudden movement, they won't bend over as quickly. And all of this information is fed to the vestibular nerve, which is going to send its information to the cerebellum of the brain in order for this part of the brain to coordinate your movements. So by comparing messages from the ampullae at the base of 3 semicircular canals, so we've got 3 sets of ampullae that are going to be bringing this information, and the brain, the cerebellum, is going to compare those messages. The brain then knows, well, this one is signaling that way, this one is signaling that way, and triangulating that information, the brain knows how your head is moving, how fast it's moving, what direction it's moving in, and therefore you are able to maintain balance.